Hey folks, thanks for joining this purely public CAA by Cap Law. Just a couple of reminders. You do have the ability to sign in via that link. So when you get a chance, you don't have to do it right now. Just go in there and sign in for the session so we have a record of your attendance. Savanna here is with Cap Law, and we're really excited for her to talk about purely public CAAs. In your app, you can see Savanna's wonderful bio, as well as some materials, I believe, that she uploaded, including the presentation. Yeah, so you should have access to all the materials. And if you have any questions or anything, just let us know, and otherwise, we'll let Savanna get going. Thank you, Savanna.
Thank you so much, and I'm just going to move the microphone just slightly because I am very short. I also understand that folks are joining virtually, so welcome to everyone online as well. As Josiah said, this session is called Purely for Public CAAs. If you caught my comments during the National Partners Update, one of the things that I'm hoping to relay today, being here at the Region 8 Conference, is that Cap Law does serve public CAAs, and that we do have particular expertise in some of the things that that you may need at your public CAA, and also that we can serve as a thought partner for local government attorneys that you might already be familiar with due to your CAA's relationship or structure within your local government. There you go. So I'm Savanna Arral. I am a staff attorney at Cap Law. I have a couple of business cards if anybody would like one up here. I almost put my passport card out as well, so if that's in the stack, please don't take that. Cap Law is the national legal expert for the Community Action Network, and like I said, that means the entire Community Action Network, public CAAs, private CAAs, state associations, and we even interface from time to time with helping state agencies when that aligns with the needs of particular CAAs or state associations. So as you can see here, 3 of the things that Cap Law does most often is we provide one-on-one individualized consultations where someone from a CAA, that could be a board member, usually an executive director, CFO, sometimes an HR member or HR director, fiscal officer, anyone in compliance, reaches out to us and says, I have a particular legal question that I would like an attorney to weigh in on. And then you get assigned to one of the 4 attorneys that works at Cap Law. We're a very small group. There's only 6 of us, so 2 staff members, 4 attorneys. And we will work with you to either help you figure out the answer to your legal question, or we will try to help you find a lawyer who can, if it's with, outside of our expertise, or if it's particularly like a state law matter in a state that we're not licensed in. We also do in-person and virtual trainings, such as these. We have our own conference every year. Next year's in Phoenix, and we do a lot of webinars. I neglected to mention during the National Partner Updates that if ProWara is familiar to you at all, and HHS's recent changes to the federal public benefits and immigration policy, we are in the process of scheduling a webinar that is going to be co-hosted with NCAP and I want to say NCAF, I'm pretty sure, where we're all going to be talking about that same topic because we have gotten a lot of questions about that since that information dropped last Thursday. And then also Cap Law has a online resource library, and it is just chock full of information, toolkits, guides, FAQs, online guides, just about every legal topic that you could possibly imagine that affects community action agencies. And throughout this presentation, I will be highlighting a couple of resources that we have that are specifically for public CAAs, but also there's more. So if you go to our resource library and you just type in the search bar, public CAA, more things will come up than what I'm going to show you today. So I'm going to be going over a lot today. Some things more in depth than others. I am going to try to be reactive to what people seem to be interested in and what I go in depth on, because there's just so much I could have possibly included in this presentation that I wanted to make sure I hit the highs and also go in deep on the things that you guys actually care about. So I'm going to talk very briefly about differences between private and public CAAs. I'm going to do quite a bit on the governance of public CAAs and the legal framework that impacts the work that public CAAs do. I'm going to talk about the tripartite board and the particular role that it plays at public CAAs that oftentimes have a multi-tiered board structure because of the way that they exist within the local government framework. And then I'm going to go over a bunch of different, what I'm calling common concerns of public CAAs. So I went back through some consultations that we've gotten from folks. I looked back through previous presentations that we've done on this topic and pooled together a list of like 8 topics that I think it would be important for people to have just base level information about in case it comes up in your work. So as I said, first, very briefly, just in case there are folks in the room, actually let me ask really quickly. Folks in the room, who here works at a public CAA? Okay, so pretty much everybody. Who here is new to working in a public CAA or community action in general? Okay, so this will be at least a little bit useful for some people in the room. And if it's not, hopefully it serves as a good refresher. We're really big into refreshers at Cap Law. Lawyers in general are really big on refreshers and remembering old information. So there are basically 2 kinds of community action agencies, public and private, and they are similar and also very different. So some of this is just basically a list of the ways in which public and private CAAs are both similar and different. They're different because they're created differently. Generally, private CAAs are incorporated under a state statute as a nonprofit, and public CAAs are formed by a public entity, whether it's pursuant to a state statute or some kind of agreement or just as an arm of local government. Both public and private CAAs are tax exempt, but they are tax exempt in very different ways. So 501c3 is part of the IRS code. It is something that does not apply to local governments. It applies to nonprofits, but it is something that we talk a lot about when we talk about CAAs, but it's not applicable to public CAAs generally. Governance. Under both the CSBG Act and the CSBG organizational standards, both public and private CAAs must have a tripartite board that plays a very special role in the governance of their organization. Regulation. Public and private CAAs are regulated very differently. The general laws that would apply to a nonprofit private CAA are a state nonprofit corporation law, whereas a public CAA as a part of the local government is usually governed significantly by local ordinances. Funding, both funded by CSBG, that's what makes a CAA, and also can have a variety of other federal, state, and local grants, as well as private donations and other sources of funding. In monitoring, both public and private CAAs are monitored by state agencies, state CSBG agencies, I should say. There are also lots of different types of public CAAs, and this is something that makes it sometimes a little bit difficult for me to talk broadly about public CAAs because they all kind of look and act a little bit different, and it's very state specific. So the most common type, I would say, is a public CAA that is a division or a department of a local government. So for those of you that work in a public CAA right now, are you a division or department of a local government? Okay, some of you are not, okay. The second most common way that we see public CAAs be formed is pursuant to a state statute or local ordinance. I know Tennessee is not part of this region, but it is the quintessential example of this kind of CAA. They have an entire law called the Human Resource Agency Act that essentially creates these public entities completely separately from local government that then have become CAAs. I will say, sometimes people get caught up on this because they think that certain language in their name has made them a public CAA. For example, in Montana, there are human resource development councils that are not public CAAs, even though it kind of sounds like they should be public CAAs because Human Resource Development Council sounds like it's part of the local government. Long story short, they used to be, they aren't anymore. So that comes up a couple of times. And then the third most common way that we see public CAAs be formed is as an instrumentality of local government, an interdepartmental project, or some kind of entity that's subject to joint public and private control. The best example of this that I could find for this region is the Utah Interlocal Cooperation Act, which is what all of the public CAAs in Utah are formed under, that's my understanding. And essentially it's kind of a combination of option 2 and option 3. It's a state statute, but it is specifically a state statute about creating these interdepartmental organizations that then receive CSBG and become public CAAs. Is anybody here part of a public CAA that is not described by any of these options? Yes. Yes, quasi-public is kind of this weird world where we would generally, most quasi-public CAAs, we would think of as public CAAs because, yeah, they function primarily as a form of or as part of the local government, but they have some independence. The real thing that ties all of these options together for how a public CAA can be formed is that they are in some way controlled by government, which is really what differentiates them from a private CAA, which may have contracts with government, may provide some services to government, but is actually a private nonprofit and has its own organizational structure completely separate from government. There we go. As I alluded to, there are some laws that if you go into Cap Law's resource library and you look at some of our resources, because of the makeup of the Community Action Network, and I'm going to butcher the statistic, but I think it's like 20-something% of all CAAs across the country are public CAAs. So the vast majority are private nonprofit CAAs. So we have to do a little bit of balancing when we're creating our resources, and we have to cover obviously things that will apply to one group and not the other. So if you're in our resource library and you see some of these laws mentioned and you're a public CAA, that part of the resource may not be applicable to you. So I mentioned before 501c3, that is the federal tax law that governs nonprofits, tax-exempt nonprofits. But local governments generally tax exempt under a completely different section of the Internal Revenue Code. I am not going to bore you with tax law, do not worry, that is my thing, not everybody else's. But generally it's local governments that serve an essential government function are tax exempt under the Internal Revenue Code. State nonprofit corporation laws only apply to state nonprofits. So if we mention bylaws, I'm going to talk about bylaws quite a few times actually during this presentation. But state nonprofit corporation laws like the Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act do not apply to public organizations or to entities that aren't organized under the state's Nonprofit Corporation Act. That can get confusing sometimes for people because they think I'm charitable, but being charitable is a different thing from being a nonprofit. That's a legal designation. 8 of the 58 CSBG organizational standards do not apply to public CAAs, and they very nicely just write NA, so you can quite easily see which ones do and do not apply to public CAAs. And then, like I said, bylaws. Sometimes, or actually oftentimes, we will see public CAAs that have bylaws. But usually bylaws are required by state nonprofit corporation acts. So it can be one of those things where we actually recommend usually that there's some kind of internal governance document that public CAAs have, unless it's required by a local ordinance or by your agreement with the local government that you're a part of. bylaws are usually not legally required. They're just the most common form of internal governance document that we see, regardless of whether an organization is public or private. Does anyone here in the room know if their public CAA has bylaws? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, like I said, most typical form, it's the thing that people are the most familiar with, and sometimes people call a thing a bylaws, and then I actually open the document and it's not bylaws, but that's okay too. We all know what it means. It's about internal governance. Now I'm going to go into more governance. So the governance of public CAAs. In this first slide, this is my baby. This is my favorite slide. I put it in every presentation. But I change the laws depending on what I'm talking about, because I like to show people that when they say, what laws are affected by my question, I have to go, a lot, a lot of them, because there are a myriad of state, federal, local laws, and by laws I mean statutes and regulations and also guidance that may or may not be legally binding, as we lawyers like to say, as well as internal documents that you might have. Contractual agreements are a type of law. There's all sorts of things. When somebody asks me a question, what do? I have to go, okay, let me go down the checklist of all of the different places where the answer to this question could be, and sometimes I don't have access to that information. It might be something that's internal to your organization, and sometimes it just requires me going through every single source and saying, what does this say about the thing that I'm being asked about? Excuse me. So now I'm going to talk about each of those nice pop-ups in turn, starting with the Federal CSBG Act and the HHS Block Grant Regulations. So who here has heard of the CSBG Act? Wonderful. So the CSBG Act, actually I think David Bradley might have just mentioned it because he was like the architect of it, I believe. It's essentially the main federal legal framework for community action. The CSBG Act, particularly for public CAAs, is what establishes that a political subdivision or a public organization can be what's called an eligible entity under the statute, which is, it's just the word that the statute uses for a CAA. The CSBG Act also provides a lot of information about how money flows down to the states to then be delivered to local organizations, public and private CAAs, as well as specific governance requirements for community action agencies, including, most importantly, in my opinion, the tripartite board. The CSBG Act requires that the tripartite board for both public and private CAAs participate actively in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of programs that are paid for using CSBG dollars. In addition to the CSBG Act at the federal level, there is also the HHS Block Grant Regulations. So this is kind of a more technical legal area, but HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, they are the main agency within which the Office of Community Services, OCS, sits. OCS oversees CSBG. The Office of Head Start also sits within HHS, as do many other sources of funding that we see CAAs receive. But importantly, not WAP, that is Department of Energy. The HHS block grant regulations apply to block grants, and block grants are a specific type of grant where they are delivered in a quote-unquote block to the state to then get passed down to organizations to use in their programming. The HHS block grant regs for CSBG are pretty light, but there's some more general ones that apply to all block grants. And the most important part of the block grant regulations that I wanted to point out for you today are on termination. The CSBG Act does talk about the requirements that a state has to go through before it can terminate a CAA's CSBG funding. But the HHS block grant regulations go a little bit further, and they actually provide that a state has to give notice and an opportunity for a hearing on the record prior to terminating funding. So one of the things that we talk about a lot with grants, especially right now, is that grants feel like they can be terminated at will, right? But CSBG, through the CSBG Act and also through the HHS block grant regs, is a little bit more protected because there is federal law that says what requirements have to be gone through before a state can terminate CSBG funding from a CAA, public or private. I don't know where to point this. There we go. The first of the cap law resources that I will point you to today, this one is the CSBG training module. This one, it does have a section on public CAAs, but it's much more focused on the basic information about CSBG, starting from the history of the grant all the way back to the 60s, and then generally through the structure of the CSBG Act and tripartite board and governance and that sort of thing, as well as termination. So if you are new, if you are one of the folks that raised their hand when I asked if you're new to community action or to your public CAA, I would highly recommend you go through this training module. You can pause it, there's little quizzes in between. Before I started at Cap Law, actually before my interview with Cap Law, I went through this training module and talked about it in my interview, and I think it may have gotten me the job. It's also quite good. In addition to federal law, there are also what we call OCS IMs and the org standards. So who's familiar with the org standards? Okay, good. I'll start with OCS IMs. So the Office of Community Services, OCS, releases non-binding guidance called information memoranda, IMs, that flesh out parts of the CSBG Act that might not be clear or maybe a little bit hard to read or just are written in legalese and not necessarily super useful to somebody who goes, okay, yeah, I know what those words mean, but how do I implement that on the ground? And IMs many of these are very long-standing. They've been around for decades. IMs are really OCS's way of going, here's how we, the federal agency that is responsible for this funding, interpret the law, the requirements of the law that govern this funding. In particular, OCS IM 82 really fleshes out the tripartite board requirements of the CSBG Act, and it has a lot to say about both public and private tripartite boards. In particular, that public agency boards are advisory and are intended to guide public officials that manage their agencies, both elected and appointed, with information and advice on how to reduce poverty within the geographic area being served. I'll talk about this a little bit more in probably 10 slides, but generally what we see is that public CAAs have tripartite boards that serve in an advisory role to another board, usually county commissioners or city council or a board within some kind of local government structure. Still, IM 82 tells us it is very important that the tripartite board exists because it is still an active part of ensuring that CSBG funding is being used to fulfill the purposes of the CSBG Act. The CSBG org standards, the organizational standards, also came from an IM. So IM 138 is what kind of established the org standards and told the states you have to adopt these by, I think, 2015, maybe 2016. And now all of the states have, in fact, adopted the org standards and they use them in their monitoring process. Like I said, there are certain org standards that aren't applicable to public CAAs just because of the nature of how they're structured. This is a list of them here. The first one, 5.3, is on board governance. The second one, 7.1, is on human resource management, and the rest of them are on financial operations and oversight, which honestly I think those are mostly in recognition of the fact that local governments just have completely different funding structures than nonprofits do. And some of the requirements in the org standards for nonprofits just don't make sense in a local government context. Got to point it at the laptop. In addition to federal laws on CSBG, the Federal CSBG Act, federal regulations, federal guidance, there's also state laws. So states under the block grant regulations, this 45 CFR 9650, because CSBG is a block grant, the HHS block grant regulations recognize that states are the ones who are primarily responsible for interpreting the governing statutory provisions of that block grant. So the buck kind of stops with the states when it comes to how do we enforce the CSBG Act. This usually happens in the form of states passing statutes or their own regulations, usually in an administrative code, that are their own mini CSBG Act. So the North Dakota State CSBG Act or the Montana State CSBG regulations. And those will, they can't conflict with the federal CSBG Act, but they can sure add to it. So sometimes we see states that will add quite a bit to the CSBG framework, from mandating board sizes to number of board meetings, and I'm only thinking about board things right now, but lots of different stuff. Or sometimes we see a state that has a state CSBG law, but it's really just reiterating the requirements of the federal law. So it doesn't add anything new. It just says, here's what the federal law says. We agree with the federal law, and we wanted to put that in writing, which is kind of nice. But if you're ever curious to look at your own state's CSBG law or regulations, the best place that I've found to look is the CSBG state plan. In section 2, there's a part that gets filled out that literally asks, does your state have a CSBG statute? Does your state have CSBG regulations? And if so, please tell us where they are. And that is the #1 place that CAPLaw goes to for looking for those laws, because it is the fastest way to find them, because they all have different names. Some states also don't have any CSBG laws or regulations. In this region, Colorado and South Dakota are the two that I found that have nothing that I was able to find on the books in their own state code or statutes. State agencies, just like OCS, can also release written guidance that may have various levels of bindingness depending on the structure of the state. In New Jersey, I was just grappling with a policy that they have had since, I want to say 1998, that requires all of the CAAs in their state to comply with the state's open meetings law. And it's written on a piece of paper that has been scanned approximately 100 times, but it is binding. In New Jersey, it is a requirement. Everyone agrees to it. And the only way that you would know that is if you went to New Jersey's state CSBG office's website and clicked on that link. So thankfully, most CAAs in New Jersey seem to know this, but I'm just pointing out to you that there may be more information than you realize that is in your that is available from your state CSBG agency about things that you arguably should be complying with or should know about at least. So that's on the compliance side. On the other side is states oftentimes release really helpful written materials, implementation manuals, lists of monitoring standards. These things are incredibly useful, particularly to people who are new to their roles that are just like, how do I even wrap my head around this system, this structure that exists? I would highly recommend, if your state has something like that, use it, engage with it, and if your state doesn't have something like that and you have a good relationship with your state agency, maybe encourage them to create a similar one, because I've found that the states that have those, the CAAs that I speak with, are much more fluent in the legal structure that exists at their state for the CSBG framework. There we go. Very briefly, obviously, every grant, especially federal grants, is going to come with its own legal framework. There's just a smattering of grants that I typically see CAAs have, as well as the statute and the regulations that govern that particular grant. It is really important that you read your grant agreements, and I know that I sound like such a lawyer right now, but it is so important that you read your grant agreements. You would be in disbelief as to what is in some of these agreements. And I know that oftentimes you don't have the power to actually remove things or argue that something shouldn't be included in a grant agreement, but it's still really important that you know it's there, right? So in particular, I want to just point out that grant agreements can incorporate laws that you wouldn't otherwise know were on that list of fun pop-ups that I had a couple of slides back. We know the Uniform Guidance applies. We know the CSBG Act applies. Reading your grant agreement, there may be other laws that are being applied to you that wouldn't otherwise apply to you that you just won't know about, and cap law won't know about, unless we read your grant agreement as well. So just a plug for, please read your grant agreement, and don't assume that everybody else has read your grant agreement, because I know how annoying it can be to read those grant agreements. A couple more things on the governance of public CAAs. State and local government laws and internal documents. This is where things I have to get really broad and wishy-washy, because everything is a little different in every state. But on a basic level, when I say laws, like I said, they include statutes, they include regulations, and for this purpose, they also include ordinances, which is just fancy lawyer word for a law that's issued by a local government, typically in something like the Denver Municipal Code. It's associated with a city or a locality, sometimes a county, but not a state or a federal government. Excuse me. State and local government laws that apply to public CAAs through virtue of them being part of local governments or controlled by local governments, can govern basically anything. I've just listed a couple of things here. How the public entity that a CAA is associated with functions. Is it a city council? Is there one person? Is there just a mayor in the structure of the organization that your CAA rolls up into? The scope of your CAA's authority. Is your board advisory? Does your board have decision-making authority? What's the scope of that authority? The relationship with other public and private entities. Do you have memorandums of understanding with other arms of the local government about services that you provide to them or they provide to you? Do you have shared services? Do you have one fiscal department that is in charge of all of the parts of the local government that you're a part of, or do you have your own fiscal department? I've seen that before, where a CAA it's a public CAA, it's an arm of the local government, but it has its own fiscal department, and that gets really complicated. And then also how CAA board meetings are governed. I'm going to talk about open meetings laws. Who's familiar with open meetings laws? Okay, just a couple of people, but open meetings laws can be the bane of people's existences, and they apply to pretty much every public community action agency, which is it can be a bear to really deal with. I said this at the beginning, but whether it's bylaws or some kind of charter or a delineation of powers agreement, having some kind of internal governance document is really a best practice. If your organization doesn't have something like that, there has to be, if the understanding of how your board is meant to function, how your organization is meant to function within the local government structure is just word of mouth, that can result in a lot of problems. So sometimes it can be really difficult the first time that you're trying to put stuff on paper, but writing it down we tend to say is a best practice. And it doesn't have to be in any particular format unless there's specific requirements in your locality. And then finally on governance is the Uniform Guidance. So the Uniform Guidance is it's a federal government-wide framework for grants management. The Uniform Guidance does apply to state and local governments that carry out federal rewards as either a recipient, direct recipient of a grant, or a subrecipient of a grant, such as through CSBG, through a pass-through entity like the state. I won't go too deeply into this, but not all of the Uniform Guidance technically applies to CSBG. But if you have other grants other than CSBG, the chances are very strong that all of the Uniform Guidance applies to you, because most of the federal grants that I'm familiar with have applied pretty much all of the Uniform Guidance to that specific grant, and states have often incorporated the entirety of the uniform guidance into their CSBG grant agreements. So even if, such as here, subpart C and D of the uniform guidance didn't apply to CSBG on their face, your state grant agreement probably says something like, and you'll abide by the uniform guidance. You agree to do everything in accordance with the uniform guidance. And it doesn't say, except for subpart C and D, it just says the uniform guidance, and that means all of it. We have lots of resources, by the way, on the uniform guidance. It is wildly complicated. It was one of the hardest things for me to wrap my head around when I first started doing this work. And honestly, most days it is still hard for me to wrap my head around because it can apply to so many different situations. So if you have questions about the uniform guidance, I think I mentioned this in the partners update, but we have a really cool crosswalk that's going to be coming out soon with NASCASP that will do some comparing and some calling out of recent substantive important changes that have occurred in the last year with the uniform guidance that I'd say most of them are pretty positive, have a pretty positive impact on the Community Action Network, but are still just good for people to know so that they can adjust their financial practices accordingly. I want to do a quick little knowledge check. There's a couple of these throughout this presentation. So would someone like to tell me how they think that IM 82 impacts the governance of public CAAs? If you remember, IM 82 is the OCS information memorandum about the tripartite board. There are very few wrong answers here. Just shout stuff out. Non-binding, there you go, that's good, yes. So they're not technically law, but everybody kind of treats them that way. And also, I will say, some state grant agreements will also say, we treat OCS information memoranda as binding. So again, another reason to read your grant agreement. How about the uniform guidance? What is a way that the uniform guidance impacts your public CAA? It governs the way that you have to, what's allowable for costs, for example. So the uniform guidance has a whole ton of information on specific kinds of costs that are allowable or aren't allowable. And that applies to your public CAA as much as private CAAs. There is a particular part of the cost allowability provisions of the uniform guidance that I will briefly go over in the common concern section that is on general expenses of government that is particularly important for public CAAs to be aware of. And how about the CSBG Act? Easiest one for last. How does the CSBG Act impact the governance of your public CAA? Yeah, exactly. It impacts the entirety of all of the way that you're supposed to fulfill the purpose of CSBG funding. In particular, it requires that you have a tripartite board. So, next section of the presentation, it is 2:08, okay, is going to be on tripartite board roles and responsibilities. So if you read the CSBG Act, the federal CSBG Act, the section about tripartite boards, you will notice that there is a difference in the language in the way that the CSBG Act talks about private CAA tripartite boards and public CAA tripartite boards. All of that matters, but this org standard pretty much sets the tone that both public and private CAAs have to have the same basic structure, which is, and there will be a nice little pie chart in just a bit, exactly 1/3 public officials or their representatives, at least 1/3 low-income representatives, and then the remainder from the private sector. Oh, nope, go back. I have excerpted the entirety of this part from the CSBG Act because I think it is that important. There is, other than a tripartite board, technically another way that a public CAA can meet call them the board governance requirements of the CSBG Act, and that is what we call the another mechanism. Importantly, though, the another mechanism is not something that can be selected by a particular public CAA. It is a state-level thing. So states can say, hey, if you can't have a tripartite board, if it just doesn't work with the way that your public CAA is set up, or it just doesn't make sense, we have determined that X, Y, and Z are perfectly valid ways for you to still ensure that there is adequate participation by low-income individuals in your organization, and that they are actively involved in the planning and implementation and development of your CSBG programs. I hate to bring up New Jersey again because they're just on my brain, but New Jersey is actually one of the states that I know of off the top of my head that has guidance that says, we prefer the tripartite board for public CAAs, but here's 3 different ways that if that doesn't work for you, you can do something else other than the tripartite board. And then they very nicely also say, if you have a different idea, please come talk to the state agency and we'll let you know if that works or doesn't work. So it's very state by state, but it is one of the things that differentiates private and public CAAs within the CSBG network. All private CAAs have a tripartite board. Not all public CAAs have a tripartite board, even though most do. And that's because of this another mechanism language. And here is the fun little pie chart that I mentioned. This is the general structure of the tripartite board. For the rest of this part of the presentation, I am going to be presuming that public CAAs are using the tripartite board mechanism for board governance, because I just can't speak to all of the different ways that the another mechanism language could function. One big thing that I've alluded to a couple of times, and that comes up a lot, is that public CAA board powers, so the tripartite board powers, depend heavily on what authority is delegated to the tripartite board by the local governing body that they're a part of. So unlike private CAAs, where the tripartite board is the board, capital T, capital B, the tripartite board for a public CAA may not serve as the place where the buck stops, necessarily. So in a public CAA, a tripartite board may serve a purely advisory role, where it has no decision-making capabilities. It only makes recommendations to a higher board, a city council, a county commission, or it could be essentially a quote-unquote nonprofit that is working within the structure of the local government. It is a public entity, but for all intents and purposes, it does its own thing. It's completely independent. Its board has all the decision-making power that it needs. I usually see that structure where CSBG is the only thing that public CAA is. Oh gosh. I hope everybody's okay. That was a loud sound. Where I usually see that structure where CSBG is the only source of funding that CAA is in charge of, where they say, take it and run with it. Take CSBG, it's all yours, run with it. Like I said, bindiness of decision-making, some kind of agreement between a public CAA's tripartite board and the higher governing body will usually say what level of ability that the tripartite board has to say, this is the decision, we're going with this, we have the authority to say yes or no. And then whether or not, does anybody here have Head Start? Okay, I assumed not, but within Head Start, just a slight detour, there's this concept called the Policy Council, where the Policy Council is a board of usually Head Start parents that kind of sits co-equal to, but not completely co-equal to, the tripartite board of the CAA or the governing board if it's not a CAA, where the Policy Council has some things that are statutorily within its power to make decisions about, but most things they're just making recommendations to the higher board. And if those two bodies disagree, if the board and the Policy Council disagree about things, the Head Start Act requires them to have what are called impasse procedures, basically internal mediation procedures for how to deal with disagreements. In the public CAA context, it's more likely that it's just the higher governing body says yes or no, and the tripartite board is given some kind of like, we really want your opinions and thoughts, but we have the finals, but we, higher governing body, have the final say, not you. I will say that the CSBG Act and multiple OCS IMs are pretty clear that the tripartite board in a public CAA, even if it is just in an advisory capacity, should still have direct oversight over programs and services that are supported by CSBG funds. The tripartite board, even if it doesn't have any decision-making abilities at all, if it has no power, if it's purely advisory, it still should be in a position to have knowledge and oversight over CSBG-led programs. That's a requirement of the federal CSBG Act. The CSBG Act is also very clear about the role that the tripartite board plays, which is, and I'll just say it from the quote, it's participate actively in development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of CSBG-funded programs. IM 82 gives some examples of ways that public CAA boards specifically can actively participate, as the statute says, including by acting as a key player in community needs assessments, by being a primary source of information and insight about the community served. You know, yes, in the tripartite board structure, you're required to have at least 1/3 of those people be representatives of the low-income community in the service area, but public officials that serve on the board, people who are in the private sector who are just members of the community that serve in various roles, they have important insight about what services, what programs would be most useful to the CSBG service area, to the folks in that area. And then also the board can participate actively in a public CAA setting by clarifying the mission of the organization. And the board has the helm still. They have oversight, they have the ability to say, this is aligned with what we're required to do with CSBG funding. This isn't aligned. This is what our organization is about. This is what our goal is. Here's how we get there. I also did want to point out that Organizational Standard 6.1 requires public CAAs to have strategic plans or some kind of comparable document. This is also required of private CAAs, but this is one of those org standards where I think that maybe people skip over it because they don't necessarily, or they're not really involved in this space, but strategic plans should be part of the tripartite board's role at a public CAA as much as they are at a private CAA. This is a question that has come up a bit frequently or recently, which is the size of the tripartite board. Technically, if you have 3 sectors of your board, and one of those sectors has to be exactly 1/3 of the board, that means that your board number has to be divisible by 3. It can be argued sometimes, and also sometimes state laws will contradict this reading of the CSBG Act, but generally we would say tripartite board, 3 sectors, has to be divisible. The number of total directors should be divisible by 3. I will say, though, that the CSBG Act says nothing about the minimum or maximum number of people that you can have on your board, and really, unless state or local law specifies a minimum or maximum total number of directors, the goal with the size of your board should be about flexibility, management, and also continuing to ensure that the tripartite board, particularly for public CAAs, is serving the purpose it's supposed to statutorily, which is to ensure that the voice of the community being served is heard and is involved in the oversight of CSBG programs. I'm going to talk a little bit about the selection of directors for the tripartite board. This information is pretty much applicable to both private and public CAAs, but I think it's really important, and we talk a lot about this at Capilon, and we get a lot of questions about it, so I figured I'd include it. The CSBG Act says that the tripartite board is to be selected by the organization. I just want to point out that there's a language difference between the CSBG Act and then IM 82 and then the private CAA section of the CSBG Act, which use the words eligible entity. I think it's just a drafting thing. But generally, our understanding is that this means that the local governing body is responsible for selecting directors unless that responsibility is delegated to the tripartite board. The tripartite board can always be permitted to make recommendations even if selection authority isn't granted. So does anyone, I'm actually curious now, does anyone just raise your hand if your tripartite board is responsible for director selection? Okay, so a couple of hands. Yeah. And everybody else, it's the local governing body is responsible for filling out that tripartite board. Okay. Good to know. That's just mostly for my brain. I start with the low-income sector and selection of low-income sector directors because I think that this is the most important sector of the board, especially for public CAAs, and I think that if you read the CSBG Act, you'll see that there's a particular emphasis on the importance of low-income representation on public CAA boards. There's also a particular requirement for public CAAs, which is that low-income sector directors have to live in your CSBG service area. This is not true for most private CAAs unless their state law adds it as an additional requirement. But because there's this, there's some differences in the way that some public CAAs have their governance structure, that another mechanism language. At the end of the day, the drafters of the CSBG Act found it really important that we make sure that the voice of the community that is being served by this organization is directly represented on the board. I will also point out that low-income sector directors, we call them that. Sometimes they're called community directors. Community engagement directors is another form of the language that I've seen. But they should represent low-income individuals and families in the service area. They do not themselves have to be low income. And if you're having a particular problem filling out those seats on your board or finding people who are willing and able to serve, because board service is a significant drain on people's time, it's difficult, then just remove that unless it's required somewhere else from your requirements, from your restrictions. We do recommend that as much as you can, people be low income themselves, because that is your service population, that is the voice that we want to make sure is represented. But so long as they represent low-income individuals and families in your service area, you're fulfilling that requirement. CSBG Org Standard 5.2, I tried like 15 times to make a separate slide to show all of it, but it's very, very long. It talks about this concept of democratic selection, which I have done entire presentations on democratic selection and direct selection and micro-democratic selection. But essentially, you are required, your public CAA is required to have written procedures for the democratic selection, or public CAAs only, another mechanism that the state has said that you are allowed to do other than democratic selection that ensures that this voice is represented. Public sector. Elected public officials or their representatives who are holding office on the date of selection should make up exactly 1/3 of your tripartite board. IM 82 indicates that directors should stay in this sector only while they are in office. Some states also require this under their state law, that if you have a public official on your board and they lose office, they also lose their seat on your CSBG, or they no longer count towards your public sector director requirement on your CSBG board. With public CAAs, one of the things that we run into is that oftentimes the public officials will be the same people who are part of the local governing body that the tripartite board rolls up to, or is the advisory body to. One of the recommendations that we make quite frequently is that the public sector be used on the tripartite board to get other public voices into the framework, because the local governing body is already going to have some kind of power, some kind of say in the structure. So if your tripartite board has to advise a local a county commissioner's board, having three of those county commissioners sit on your CSBG board isn't going to add any more thoughts to the room than would have already been there. So consider having some of those seats on the tripartite board be folks who aren't already involved in some way in the decision-making process for what goes on at your CAA. And then also, and this is kind of in direct response to this IM82 idea of public sector officials should be public sector officials the entire time, we recommend setting term lengths for public sector board seats in your bylaws so that there's a clear delineation of when does someone lose their seat, when does someone get to stay in their seat. This is probably the most frequent question that we get asked by people where they go, our bylaws say this, but we've always done that, and then they just get really confused and everybody's upset. So having clear limitations for when a public sector official stays in their public sector board seat is particularly important. The private sector is kind of, I don't want to call it a catch-all sector because I think people think about it that way, but in reality, I think it's got so much potential for really just ensuring that your board is representative of your community. It's very flexible. This list that I've got here of all the different kinds of groups or organizations or interests that are in the community is not exclusive. So if none of these work for your community, if it's not a particularly religious community, if there's no real, if law enforcement is not at the state level or the county level and it's not really relevant to your service area, if your school district is not in your service area, like when I grew up, my school district, I had like an hour and a half long bus ride every morning. So some people, some tripartite boards, this list doesn't make sense for where they're located. So the private sector is really a representation of acknowledging that CAAs know their service area, they know their community, and that they should encourage those voices in their community to be on their board. Fiduciary duties, I only go until 3, right? Yeah. Just looking at the clock, I will pretty much skip over this, but mostly fiduciary duties don't apply to public CAAs. They're usually a factor of the state nonprofit corporation law, but they're still probably a really good idea. Like, we like the idea that people are diligent, faithful, and adhere to the rules of their organization. That just sounds like being a good director. So even if you're not legally required to, big thumbs up for fiduciary duties from Cap Law. And then governing documents, I've already mentioned this a couple of times, but having some kind of internal document that guides how your board operates, an operating manual for your board in whatever form that either has to come in based on your local laws or you decide that it comes in, also a good idea. Good to have all the rules written down so everybody knows what they are. Those governing documents also, according to CSBG Org Standard 5.4, have to be given to your board at least once in the past 2 years. Couple of knowledge checks, true, false. I'll just have people raise their hands. So true or false, a public CAA may choose whether to use the tripartite structure as set forth in the federal CSBG Act for its board. Who thinks this is true? Who thinks this is false? It is, in fact, false. The public CAA cannot choose. It is the state that chooses. So a little bit of a trick word question, but this is the another mechanism thing. Your CAA does not get to decide to just go, we've chosen another mechanism. That another mechanism has to be stated by your state before you can choose to do that. Otherwise, you're going with the tripartite board. All right, the local governing, true or false, the local governing body selects tripartite board members unless it has delegated this responsibility to the board. Who thinks this is true? Who thinks this is false? It is true. I think I went over this pretty much directly, but the general understanding is that the power to select directors sits with the eligible entity, which would be the local government. We have a pretty extensive resource that's called the Role of the Public CAA, Roles and Responsibilities of Public CAA Boards, that goes into a lot of the information that I've gone over today, as well as lots of other things. Highly recommend checking it out. And if you can't find it, feel free to email me and I will find it for you. I'm not gonna go through this, but I would just say, ask yourselves, do you know how your public CAA selects directors for each of the tripartite sectors, and if you don't, and if that's important to your role, I know for some people it's just not, that's totally okay, but if it is important to your role, or if you're just curious, check out what exists for governance documents at your organization. See if there's some kind of manual about the democratic selection procedures that you use, for example. You might be surprised what you find. And I'm going to spend the last half hour going over some common public CAA concerns, and hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. So the first concern that we see public CAAs come to cap law with often is about conflicts of interest. And IM 82, I would honestly just read IM 82. It's written in nice plain language. It's very accessible to people who aren't lawyers, even though it sounds scary because it's called an information memoranda. But IM 82 says that the very nature of tripartite representation on boards creates potential conflict of loyalty or interest situations. And that's true. You have public officials on your board who may also, in another role, be voting on how much funding your organization gets, or whether or not to remove the CEO of your organization, or I guess it's not super relevant for public CAAs, but remove a staff member, for example, who to hire, whether or not there should be a hiring freeze. There might also just be, they might serve in dual roles. You might have a county commissioner who's on your board and is also on the county commission that your board rolls up into. There might be multiple conflicts of interest policies or codes of ethics at play. We get questions all the time from folks saying, well, one of our board members is on like 6 different boards and they have 6 different conflicts of interest and codes of ethics policies. And honestly, the real answer to what to do in that situation is know what hat you're wearing. If you're wearing your hat where you're a member of the tripartite board, you are bound by that conflict of interest policy. You are bound by the code of ethics that applies to you as a member of that board. You should be acting, even though fiduciary duties, as I said, technically usually don't apply to public CAA directors. You should be acting like a reasonably prudent person. You should be thinking about the best interest of the organization that you are in charge of governing at that time. So it can be a difficult balance, especially if you have a high level public official that sits on your board that says, I'm really worried about the optics of this. Press and PR are questions that we get all the time, and unfortunately those are, they're not really legal questions. They're questions about how do you manage and balance the competing interests that exist. But I do think that it is really the first thing that I always tell people is this bit from IM 82, which is that the nature of tripartite boards and community action is that there will be conflicts. We just have to figure out a way to manage them, to report them, to acknowledge that they exist in order to, or have people recuse themselves if they need to, or if they want to feel more comfortable. But it's a management concern oftentimes more than it is actually a legal concern. I will also mention that CSBG Org Standard 5.6 does require that your tripartite board, every director, sign a conflict of interest policy or some kind of comparable document within the last 2 years. So another thing to go back to your CAAs and look at, do you know where your conflict of interest policy is? Is it the same one for everybody that's in your local government? Is there one that's specific to your particular part of the local government? Interesting question to ask yourself. Linkages and coordination. This is another big thing that I think in particular recently has come up a lot, that we've gotten a lot of questions on, or at least I've answered a lot of questions on recently. The CSBG Act anticipates and actually requires states to make assurances about creating linkages and connections between government, between nonprofits, between lots of different organizations that exist within a service area in order to provide effective delivery and also avoid duplication of services. That's a huge thing that I think it particularly impacts public CAAs, where your local government might say, we're doing this service, but another nonprofit wants to do this service as well. Is there a way that we can work together on that? Does it make more sense for the nonprofit to take over that aspect of providing services? Are they sustainable? Is there some kind of relationship here? Is there a sub-grant relationship that can exist where we can kind of take the weight off of the local government and turn around and pass it to a nonprofit? But I see this frequently, particularly in areas where a CAA, a nonprofit CAA actually, has a very large service area where they have one city and a whole bunch of rural communities. So in the city, it's easy. Their population that they're trying to give services to is close to their offices. They can come and get services from them. They feel like they're close to this community. But their service area covers another 100 square miles outside of that city that they don't necessarily have staff members, effective enough staff members to be able to go into those communities. So what do? They coordinate with local governments in those areas, and they say, we have X percentage of our budget that can be sub-granted to you, local government, to help provide these services that you're not already doing, that we would usually do, but we don't have the staff to do. So linking together local government, private nonprofits in order to effectively use CSBG dollars to provide services to low-income individuals and families. There's a complicated world of sub-granting and subcontracting agreements. Again, I actually am doing an entire presentation on that at NCAP. So if you're at NCAP, come watch me talk about sub-granting, subcontracting, and sub-recipient monitoring. So I won't go too deeply into that, but I will say that this is not uncommon. It is really normal for particularly public CAAs to do some kind of sub-granting to private nonprofits to either supplement services that nonprofit's already providing that the local government wants to support, or to provide the services that the local government is like, we got 2 staff members and we cannot do this. We just don't have the capacity for it. I previewed this earlier, but importantly, under the uniform guidance, there is a particular provision that pretty much only comes up in the public CAA context, which is that the general costs of government are not allowable costs, so you can't charge them to your federal grants. Again, slightly complicated meaning of like what this means, but essentially, if your organization, if your local government is in charge of, let's say, trash collection, cleaning up the sides of roads and things like that, public roadways, you most likely cannot charge to your CSBG grant the salaries of the employees that are cleaning up like the roads that are in low-income communities, because that's a public government function that you are already doing that is not directly connected to the use of your CSBG funding. Again, this is very situationally determined, but it has popped up, and it is something that I think is important to point out to this crowd, that there is this particular language that can impact the way that you decide to look for sub-grants and for linkages and those sorts of things. So I guess a general good rule of thumb is that sub-granting should be for your CSBG services, not for your government services charged to your CSBG grant, if that makes sense. Open meetings laws. This is kind of my favorite thing / the thing that keeps me up at night. So open meetings laws are state laws. Every state has one. They are all different. There is no federal open meetings law that applies to all organizations. There is a federal open meetings law, but it only applies to like 15 federal agencies. So if you Google it and you're like, Savanna was wrong, there is one. Yes, there is, but it does not apply here, I promise. The thing about open meetings laws is that usually where this comes up for cap law is a private CAA comes to us and says, does my state's open meetings law apply to me? And I have to go through a lot of things in order to answer that question. With public CAAs, The answer to that question is almost always yes, because open meetings laws are intended to promote government transparency. They are about the meetings of government, including public CAAs that are a part of, an instrumentality of, or at least partially controlled by local governments. So unless CAAs in your state are explicitly carved out in some way from your state open meetings law, you are probably required to comply with it, and you probably already are. Because these are state laws, I have to speak very broadly about this because I'm only licensed in Massachusetts, but every state open meetings law is different. Some of them are very, very in-depth. Some of them are very, very restrictive. Texas, very restrictive, wild. And some of them are just like, basically just say meetings have to be open to the public. And what that actually means, you kind of have to determine with the help of an attorney that can read some case law, or just kind of hope that no one asks too many questions. But the big areas where open meetings laws typically impact the meetings of tripartite boards is in the requirement that there be some form of notice of the meeting, the timing of that notice, the form of that notice, who that notice goes to. It can't just be the board members, it's about the public. You've got to, post it on the internet or put it on a bulletin board. Some states have specific state, .gov websites where they require all public organizations to post notices of their open meetings laws. Again, Texas. Public attendance. Some state open meetings laws allow not only the public to come to your meetings, but to comment at your meetings. And some of them say, you can't restrict the comments. You can't restrict the timing, you can't cut people off, you can't say that they can only talk about things that are on the agenda. They are allowed to come to your meeting and talk, because that's transparency in government. And then, this is a big one, some state open meetings laws allow people to come in with a camera and record. They don't have to be press, they don't have to be official, they're allowed to come in, they're allowed to video record, audio record, and then if you are able to have remote meetings, which not every state open meetings law allows for remote meetings, although a lot of them are kind of moving in that direction, Zoom meetings can get recorded by anybody. So that's important. And then I neglected to put on the slide, executive sessions are another big thing. Parts of meetings that you will really want to be closed, that feel like they should be about private things, compensation, firings and hirings, may or may not actually be allowed to be closed to the public. Those things might actually have to be open under your state open meetings law. And the consequences can be pretty severe. In Montana, particularly, voided actions by a state district court are like the #1 way that the open meetings law is enforced. So they say, this meeting should have been open and wasn't open, so therefore anything that happened at that meeting, null and void. That actually didn't happen. You got to redo it all. And that can be really difficult. One of the things that I've been working on is for cap law, is a state open meetings law state-by-state guide. I have done 2 of the states that are in your region, so Utah and Montana, and I am adding states as quickly as I can, but this is complicated and it takes a little while, and as I said, I am not licensed in any state other than Massachusetts, so I also have to be coordinating with attorneys in each of these states to make sure that I'm understanding things correctly. But even if your state isn't on here, this resource does include a lot of really great information just generally about compliance with open meetings laws, and it's also kind of fun because there's lots of clicky buttons and drop downs and stuff. Slightly related, public records laws. They're also all state laws. They're probably similar in applicability to state open meetings laws, in that if you're subject to the state open meetings law, you're probably subject to the state public records law, but it's not a 100% Venn diagram. One of the things similar to open meetings laws, public records laws vary. They're completely different on a state-by-state basis. But one of the best things that we're able to give for advice on public records laws is that it's a really good idea to have a single designated person, or if you're a really huge organization, maybe an office, who handles public records requests. That person should understand what the exceptions are to the law and what can or cannot be redacted. that they know deadlines. Oftentimes, public records laws have specific deadlines for when you need to get back to somebody. Even if they send you, a completely incomprehensible email, you still have to meet the deadline of 10 days after you receive that email. You have to send them something back saying that you've gotten it, you're working on it, or what are you talking about? Please explain further. They also should be familiar with your organization's record system. For every record system that I've seen a completely different record system. Everybody does it a little differently. Even if you're using the same software or everybody's using OneDrive, everybody sets it up completely differently. So whoever's responsible for responding to your public records requests, they should be familiar with where documents are kept and how documents are kept at your organization. And then also, that person would be responsible within their job duties for responding to requests, actually writing the letters back, writing the emails back, including denials. Oftentimes, even if somebody writes you a letter and says, I want police records from your CAA, and you say, we're not the police, we can't give you those records, a lot of state public records laws will still say you need to send them that letter back saying you've reached the wrong person, you've gotten to the wrong inbox, because it's about transparency in government and ensuring that people, no matter how computer illiterate they are able to understand what their tax dollars are being used for and what their government is doing. This also felt like a good point to point out that the Uniform Guidance does have a record retention requirement. I'm sure that lots of states and local governments will also have their own record retention requirements, but in the absence of that, grant-related materials are subject to the Uniform Guidance's record retention rule. Public employee unions. So the National Labor Relations Act, which is the federal law that governs most unionized employees, excludes employees of state and local governments. So the NLRA and the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board that enforces and interprets the NLRA, is mostly not relevant for public CAAs. What is relevant is a lot of state law that might allow public employees to unionize. I did look and I found that it looks like South Dakota allows its public employees to unionize. And like most state public employee unions laws that I've seen, it covers a system for responding to grievances or complaints, what the employer is required to do, what employees have to do to get a grievance through the system, and then also what the negotiating process looks like for collective bargaining, which is just the fancy word for deciding what the contract between the union and the employer is going to say. CBAs, collective bargaining agreements, are not a do-it-yourself kind of thing. Unless you are extremely experienced in negotiating collective bargaining agreements, you fully understand the landscape of your state's public employee union law, contract law, then this is something where you absolutely need a state attorney. If you already have a union, if employees at your CAA are already unionized or you're hearing about unionization, there are rules that will almost certainly apply in either case if your state has something like this. So talk to a state attorney. If you have questions about that or you don't know where to start, CapLaw I can try to help you out with that, but this is very much we won't be able to walk you through the CBA process. We will need to direct you to somebody who is in, for example, South Dakota, who is a really good employment CBA negotiation attorney. Homestretch, lobbying. I'm going to talk about lobbying, political campaign activity, and the Hatch Act real quick. So lobbying is basically the attempt to influence legislation, which is very broadly defined within the context of the Appropriations Act. Basically, federal grant law restricts the use of federal funds to pay for lobbying activities. The Appropriations Act limits the use of HHS funds, for example, all the way down to trying to influence local legislation. The Byrd Amendment and the Anti-Lobbying Act are both federal prohibitions on the use of federal funds to lobby about federal grants, essentially, like using your federal funds to get more money in your federal grant makes complete sense, but of course we had to have a law about it. And then the Uniform Guidance also has restrictions on the use of federal funds to pay for lobbying activities. State law almost certainly also limits local governments and instrumentalities of local governments. from lobbying. And if it doesn't, it probably limits the use of state or local funds to do that lobbying, or requires some kind of like registration or reporting process by anybody that actually does that lobbying. Political campaign activity, this is distinct from lobbying. Lobbying is about legislation, it's about the rules, it's about laws. Political campaign activity is about candidates and elections. Importantly, the CSBG Act prohibits CSBG funds from being used, and I'm just going to quote here, in a manner supporting or resulting in the identification of such programs with partisan or nonpartisan political campaign activity, voter transportation, or voter registration. What does it mean to be identification of such programs with? We have some interpretations, but it's really kind of wishy-washy language, and we don't have a great 100%, I can tell you right here, definition of what that phrase means. But what it comes down to is using your CSBG dollars for political campaign activity is probably fraught, if you're even allowed to do it based on your state or local laws as a part of your local government. The Hatch Act. So the Hatch Act, usually when I'm talking about the Hatch Act, I'm explaining to private CAAs that the CSBG Act pulls the Hatch Act in when it usually wouldn't apply to their employees, but in all of your cases, the Hatch Act was actually written for your employees. So the Hatch Act is a law that restricts the political activity of employees of public agencies based on how they're paid. So this fun little graph, which I actually have to look at in order to explain it to you. There are the Hatch Act restrictions. When an employee is subject to the Hatch Act, we call them a hatched employee. And hatched employees have certain restrictions based on being in one of two categories that follow them not only, and this is important, inside the workplace, but outside of the workplace as well. So if you're hatched in and out of work. So for an employee that works in connection with activities financed by any federal grants or loans, they cannot use their official authority to influence election results, and they can't coerce a hatched employee to make a political contribution. So in coercion, the literature defines coercion pretty broadly. Usually even asking another hatched employee to make a political donation can be considered a form of coercion depending on the relationship between those two employees. If the employee is, if 100% of their salary is paid out of any federal grants or loans, they can't do those two things, and they can't run as a candidate for public office in a partisan election. So that part's important, partisan election. Usually partisan election is an election where the people involved are associated with a political party, but that isn't a 100% way to define what partisan means. The quintessential example of what a non-partisan election would be is dog catcher. So generally, people who are running for dog catcher are not running as a Democrat or a Republican dog catcher. They are just running as, I would like to be the dog catcher. Like I said, I grew up in Maine, and I honestly don't think I've ever seen an election for dog catcher. But this is a very specific kind of employee, right? They have to be 100% paid out of grant funds. Even in the public context where there's a lot of grants, that employee is probably pretty rare. So just know, Hatch Act applies to your employees as parts of local government, state and local government, and that these two categories have certain restrictions on their political activity, both inside and outside of work. We have an election year refresher that is available in the Cap Law Library, the resource library that basically goes over everything that I've just said about lobbying, political activity, political campaign activity, and the Hatch Act. And then I've got just a couple more minutes, so this will be on the slides, so you'll be able to look at it. But I wanted to make sure that I had a couple minutes for questions, if anybody has any for me. So you're talking about, just for the people online, you're talking about a situation where a person on the low-income sector of the board that seat is meant to represent the low-income community in a CSBG service area, is actually a wealthy CEO who just happens to live in a lower income area of the service area. I mean, in whether or not there's any accountability for that. I would say that the accountability would come from the monitoring process at the state. The state should be looking at tripartite board requirements as part of the monitoring process. Like I said, it's part of the CSBG org standards, it's part of the CSBG Act. And I really can't see that flying. Like that's a hard argument for an organization to have to make, is that, yes, this person does effectively represent the interests of low-income individuals and families in our service area. They don't have the lived experience, even though technically there isn't a requirement that the person is low-income themselves. I would say maybe there's additional facts that would change my answer, such as the CEO works at they're the CEO, but they also in their spare time do a lot of volunteering, and they have, lots of connections within the community. They're a well-known person that works at, food banks, for example. They have a lot of interaction, and or maybe they're a member of a religious community that has like they go to a church that has a particularly large group of low-income people, but still, I would think that there's probably somebody who is a better representative of the low-income individuals and families in that service area, but it's a little bit of, balancing. It can be difficult to get people to serve on boards, and if that's the only person who can, and you can make the argument that they can fulfill that requirement, I think that's a fight you end up having with the state monitoring agency. Anyone else? Awesome. Well, 3 minutes early, but if anybody would like a business card, I have a couple of cards up here, or you can take a photo of it, email me, and I'm Caplaw, and I am always here. So thank you so much.
A big thank you to Savanna. I know I have a ton more questions, but it could not be answered in 3 minutes, so I'll touch base with you. Please do use the link in the conference app to provide some evaluation data for this workshop. And we will be doing our vendor break, afternoon break, in the Aspen Daisy room, so we welcome you all over there to grab some beverages and snacks. Thanks again to Savanna very much.
Thank you for engaging, too. That was wonderful. Yeah, I could have gone into more of that, but
It's not because they're already elected, so it's like anybody on the board could technically be their designee.
No. I just the representative stuff I didn't go into because it felt like it was a little too in the weeds for this. But yeah,
I was just wondering if there was a reason why you avoided
No.
it.
It's just yeah, it felt like it would be slightly outside of what I was trying to get across.
Sure.
But yes.
Cost allocation plan, that's one of the work standards is waived, right?
I would honestly have to double check, but I think so. Because cost allocation plans for, like, they still have to have.
They have to have one.
They have to have one, but I don't think they have to.
But the members.
Right, but I don't think they have to submit them. But I do think that is one of the changes that's kind of happening right now with the uniform guidance.
We're asking for it now.
Yeah, a lot of people are being asked for them. A lot of people are, like, we've gotten a lot of weird questions about cost allocation.
Oh, yeah, I
plans.
bet,
It seems like
yeah.
people are just doing, like, the federal government's doing weird stuff right now.
Yeah. We started requesting them.
Okay.
Hey, sir.
I'm curious about open meetings.
Oh, okay.
Because I'm sitting here and I just chatted with my boss and I'm like, I think what I'm learning is you might have to be following open meetings law for tripartite board.
What state are you in?
Colorado.
Okay, so Colorado. I have not looked very closely at Colorado's open meetings law. But are you, so Larimer County.
Yeah.
So you have a county commissioner board or
Yeah.
a county commission,
Yeah.
and then you have a tripartite board that
Within our human services.
within human services.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, the chances are very strong that I think the reason is that your tripartite board probably serves a purely advisory capacity. There's some kind of documentation that exists.
Yeah.
Sure.
And the state open meetings law exempts purely advisory bodies from.
I think that's what I was thinking, and I think,
Yeah.
and I wrote that down, like I should want to ask the question and just
Yeah.
see, because I used to work with our health department, and like our board of health was 100% open meeting, and then when I got to human services, it was like, because, yeah, the advisory or tripartite board was purely advisory.
Yeah, where it gets really confusing actually is mostly with private nonprofit CAAs that are considered quasi-public under their state's open meetings law. And then they're like, but we, like, this is an exception for advisory. And I'm like, but you're a private CAA, your tripartite board is not advisory. That's your governing board. That makes decisions.
Right.
So there's
We
that
have-
separation.
We have one of our board members, our private board members here
Oh,
today,
nice.
so I had to kind of like, during session, be like, you are advisory.
Yes,
See, like,
yes.
governing, you're not. going
And that's why I was
our
trying to be like,
director.
every state's law is different.
Yeah.
I can
Oh
only
my
talk
gosh.
I
about
was
some
going to
things.
tell you too, Colorado is, we do have public service agencies, employees can go into collective bargaining.
Oh, you can unionize too? I tried looking up some of the
Yeah.
state's laws, but I looked at Colorado and it looked like there was an older law and I wasn't sure if it was still
I
in
think
place.
it's fairly
so-
new, I think it's within the last 2 years.
Oh, okay, so there's probably something that, the resource that I was looking at was kind of old, so.
I don't know, maybe, I don't know, but I know like public,
Yeah.
they have the union bargaining.
Nice. And sometimes it's like, it's only specific employees, like, you
Yeah.
know, oftentimes enforcement will be, you know, the public employees, they're allowed to unionize.
Yeah.
Nurses that work at public hospitals and those sorts of things, but, and then there's some instances where it's just like, if you work for a state or local government,
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
unionize.
Yeah.
And that just gets, it really doesn't come up oftentimes in the nonprofit private sector at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
But it is really a concern that is very specific to public CAAs is how do we negotiate with the union? And I'm like,
Yeah.
I need you to hire a state attorney.
Yeah.
I used to do when I worked in, you know, private law with giant companies, I did collective bargaining and I worked with unions a lot and I loved that work,
Yeah.
but oh my gosh, I was 100 hours a week just on negotiating. I was like, you cannot do this by yourself.
Yeah.
You can't.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This
Thanks,
was
Sarah.
This was really helpful.
Oh,
Good,
good, I'm
good.
glad.
I
It's been a
figured
while
folks
since
were
we've done
gonna
this.
get a lot out of the cap law stuff.
Good, I'm glad. This
Um,
is that was the goal.
Just so you know, we got a weird thing in Colorado. I don't know if you looked at our program implementation where we've kind of reworded the tripartite structure. And so now I'm thinking that we actually are going,
I think it might be another mechanism.
yeah, because we use all the language, tripartite board, one-third structure, one-third income, one-third elected official,
Yeah.
that doesn't, blah, 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 but we allow, the language allows the low sector to be bigger than the elected official sector. And we went through this with our state office quite a
Yeah,
bit.
yeah.
And then the reason was we felt like that's the prioritized sector,
it is. It
maximum feasible
completely is.
participation. You lose somebody from that sector and you have it equal, then all of a sudden you're out of compliance if your state program implementation doesn't give you a time frame. So we have provided guidance, so, you know, if you can, seat more folks in the low income.
Yeah.
Then the next highest one, if not equal to the private sector, should be the elected officials, right? So the private sector couldn't be bigger than the elected
Yep.
officials, but those two
Yep.
could be equal, so just so you know, that's
Yeah,
kind of
no,
how we
that's really
structured
cool.
it here.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that when I was talking about state CSPG laws, I was trying to get across is that states can add
Yeah.
to the federal requirements that exist. They can layer stuff on top. They can add nuance.
Yeah. I wonder if we need to start kind of identifying that as another mechanism, though, because I think in the past we just said, no, we follow, you know, the tripartite structure, even though we have this kind of funny language, and we actually, just recently, like 2 years ago, Savanna, went through it internally with our state office because you folks at CAPLA had said something in a webinar that was like, it should be equal, and then also it doesn't make it divisible by 3.
Yeah.
So that's the other piece, it's like, oh, okay, but, yeah.
But there is flexibility. Like a lot
Yeah,
of
totally.
things with CSBG, it comes down to like if the state is cool with it.
Yeah, and it's on paper
Yes,
somewhere,
if the
right?
state is cool with it and it's on
Yeah,
paper.
I figured
We've
in,
had a couple of states recently come to us and say, you know, they've had extensive state CSBG laws and regulations in place for a really long time, but that they've grown over the years that now they just have so many requirements that CAAs are like, how am I ever supposed to know all of the things that I have to comply with? So
Yeah.
now they're coming to us and they're saying, what should we look at paring back first? What are the things that we should, you know, what are the things that are the most important for us to emphasize? And we always say the tripartite board, focus on the tripartite board. That's the, like, that's the core
Right.
of CAAs, is the tripartite board.
Makes it different than other
Yeah, but I would say, I
organizations
mean, if
entities.
it's working for Colorado,
It's
if
working,
everybody's on
but
the same
every time
page-
I do CAPLA stuff, I get nervous, right? 'Cause I'm like, well, I know it flies against what CAPLA's recommendations and guidance is, but I think our state office is really, really comfortable.
your
We've
state
written
office
it down
is
in
good
the
with it.
program manual.
Yep.
It's, you know, it's in our state plan,
Yeah,
so.
no, if that's, and I think that's, you know, I can't really say it in training, but it's like, if your state's cool with it, if everybody's on the same page,
Right.
there's so, with block grant, it all comes down to, is the state
Okay.
giving the thumbs up? Has the state said it in writing? We're good.
As long as that state person doesn't change over,
Yes.
and then
Oh my
it's a
gosh.
different
And then
interpretation, which
somebody
happens to us all the time, like every 2 years.
On average, I would say, since I've been in the network since 2008, we've had a new state office.
I was working with a Massachusetts CAA actually that had an issue where they had a seat on the public sector of their board that was designated for a particular like role. So like anytime someone got elected to that role, they automatically became a board member. But the turnover in that role was like every 8 months. So every time they were onboarding a new person to this public sector board seat every 8 months, and they were like, we can't keep doing this. And I was like, change your bylaws.
Everybody knows how easy it is to train people on CSBG.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Savannah.
Yeah.
This is a really great thing.
I'm glad. I'm really, really glad. Yeah, public CAAs have been a particular like focus of mine because I have worked with, you know, local governments and state governments and things like that in my prior lives, and so I think that we've always tried to find